a coastal ridge, salt wind, the kind of silence that sits heavy on old ground. Then a shovel strikes something that doesn't belong, and everything researchers thought they knew about this archipelago shifts by 3,000 years. The Ayub Cave burial site in Sarangani Province, Mindanao, had been known to locals long before archaeologists arrived with their instruments and notebooks. But knowing a place exists and understanding what it holds are two entirely different things. Let's say what came out of those chambers wasn't just bones and artifacts. It was a reordering of assumptions that had stood unchallenged for generations. Let's start with what the soil actually gave up. Researchers excavating the site found human remains arranged with deliberate care. Not abandoned, not scattered, but placed. Jade ornaments sat near the bodies. Earthenware vessels, some still intact, flanked the dead. The positioning wasn't random. Every object had been chosen, set down by hands that understood ceremony. Someone had stood in that cave and made decisions about eternity. Radiocarbon dating placed the burials at roughly 3,000 years old. That number doesn't just sound old. It repositions the entire timeline of Philippine civilization during the Metal Age transition, a period when communities across Southeast Asia were shifting from stone tools to bronze and iron, from scattered foraging to organized agricultural life. Well, the Philippines, in conventional academic frameworks, was often treated as a passive recipient of these changes, cultures arriving by sea, ideas drifting in from the mainland. The Ayub evidence complicates that story considerably. The jade alone tells a different tale. Ling-ling-o ornaments, that distinctive double-headed figure-8 shape, had already been documented across a wide arc of Southeast Asia, from Taiwan to Vietnam to the islands of the Philippine archipelago. For years, the prevailing interpretation held that these objects flowed outward from Taiwan, carried by Austronesian-speaking peoples who moved south and west in successive migration waves. Taiwan as the source, the islands as destinations. Then came the sourcing analysis. Geochemical testing on the Ayub jade pieces matched the stone to quarries in eastern Taiwan, specifically the Fengtian nephrite deposit, one of the most precisely characterized stone sources in archaeological science. This wasn't a surprise in isolation. Fengtian jade had turned up across dozens of sites throughout the region. What mattered was the context around these particular pieces. The burial assemblage showed evidence of local reworking. Some of the ornaments had been modified after their arrival, reshaped, refinished, adapted to local aesthetic preferences. This is a small technical detail that carries enormous cultural weight. Objects received from distant trading networks and then altered according to local taste are objects that have been absorbed into a living culture. They're no longer imports. Well, they've become expressions of local identity. Whoever was buried in Ayub Cave wasn't wearing foreign prestige goods. They were wearing something that had been made their own. Think about that distinction. A community that passively receives objects, keeps them unchanged, displays them as markers of distant connection. A community that reshapes those objects is asserting something. It's saying, we took this material and made it speak our language. That's not a peripheral culture on the edge of a trade network. That's an active participant in a regional civilization, one shaping its own material culture while staying connected to a much wider world. Now consider what the human remains revealed. Stable isotope analysis, examining the chemical signatures locked inside bone, gave researchers a picture of diet over time. The individuals buried in Ayub Cave consumed a mixed subsistence base. Marine protein from coastal fishing combined with terrestrial agriculture. Rice was present, so was a variety of other cultivated plants. This wasn't a society scrambling at the margins of survival. It was organized, sustained, and capable of producing enough food surplus to support specialists. People who made jade ornaments, who organized trade contacts, who performed elaborate burial rites for the dead. Surplus is the engine of complexity. Every layer of organized society, craft production, long-distance exchange, ritual life, runs on the energy that remains after basic hunger is addressed. The isotope data from Ayub suggests that 3,000 years ago, communities in southern Mindanao had crossed that threshold. You know, they weren't just surviving the coast, they were building something on it. The burial arrangement itself holds one more piece of the puzzle, and it's the piece that took the longest to interpret properly. Multiple individuals were interred together in a pattern that suggests secondary burial practices. Secondary burial means the body was first deposited elsewhere, allowed to decompose, and then the bones were collected and reinterred with ceremony in a final resting place. This is not a simple or accidental practice. It requires sustained community attention to the dead over an extended period. It requires memory, keeping track of who is buried where, returning at the right time, gathering the remains with intention. Secondary burial is a social technology. It encodes the community's relationship to its ancestors in a physical act repeated across generations. The living return to the dead. They carry them to a new place. They arrange them with objects that mark who they were. Every time this sequence repeats, the community reaffirms its continuity, a living chain reaching back through time. Cultures that practice secondary burial tend to have strong ancestor veneration frameworks. They tend to organize social authority around lineage. They tend to preserve oral traditions that explain who came before and why the present takes the shape it does. Sound familiar? Ancestor reverence isn't a colonial-era introduction to the Philippines. It's not a borrowed trait from later Hindu-Buddhist influence, or from the arrival of Islam in the southern islands, or from 3 centuries of Spanish Catholicism reshaping the spiritual landscape. It was already there. 3,000 years ago, in a cave above the Sarangani coast, people were performing the rituals that downstream generations would carry forward in forms that are still recognizable today. The deeper question the Ayub research opens isn't about a single cave or a single burial event. It's about what kind of society could produce this, and how far that society's connections reached. All right, the jade came from Taiwan. Pottery styles found at Ayub share formal similarities with assemblages documented in the Visayas, in Luzon, and in sites across island Southeast Asia. The burial practices echo traditions recorded in archaeological sites stretching from Borneo to the Mariana Islands. None of this suggests the Philippines was a hub of empire. It suggests something more interesting: a networked civilization, distributed, maritime, laterally connected, rather than vertically organized under a single center. No single capital, no imperial reach. Just a web of communities, each with its own local flavor, all maintaining relationships across the water. Trade in raw materials, exchange of ideas about how to shape jade and fire pots and bury the dead. A civilization that didn't look like Rome or Egypt because it didn't need to. It had its own logic, suited to its own geography. This is the part that tends to get lost when outsiders write the history of the Philippine archipelago. The narrative of pre-colonial Philippines has too often been framed as a waiting room, a place that existed in cultural suspension until more complex civilizations arrived and switched on the lights. That framing was always thin. The Ayub evidence helps show why. 3,000 years of recorded stratigraphy, sophisticated trade networks confirmed through material sourcing, evidence of organized food production, craft specialization, and complex mortuary ritual, all before the Bronze Age fully settled over the region. This wasn't a waiting room. It was already a world. Wait a second. The researchers who published findings from the Ayub Cave analysis were careful with their conclusions. The way good scientists are careful, unwilling to claim more than the evidence supports. The site hasn't been fully excavated. Laboratory analysis of certain assemblage components continues. New techniques for ancient DNA extraction from tropical skeletal material are advancing, and future sampling from sites like Ayub may eventually tell us more about the biological relationships between these people and other ancient populations across the region. Science doesn't finish. It keeps asking. What's already established is enough to reshape how the story of Philippine prehistory gets told, not through dramatic revision, not through the reversal of one neat narrative in favor of another. Through accumulation, one careful site report at a time, one geochemical trace at a time, one set of carefully measured bones at a time, a fuller picture assembles itself. On the other hand, the Austronesian expansion brought people, languages, and technical knowledge through this archipelago on a sweeping southward arc. That's not in dispute. But the communities they encountered, the communities that formed in their wake, the communities that traded jade and reworked it and buried their dead in caves overlooking the sea, those communities were doing something, building something. On the other hand, the cave was there long before the shovel arrived. What it held had been waiting with patience that puts human ambition in its proper proportion. 3,000 years of silence, and then a geochemist reads a stone and tells you where it was born. A physical anthropologist reads a bone and tells you what a person ate. A ceramic specialist reads a pot and places it in a tradition shared across half an ocean. Moving on. The past doesn't disappear. It waits to be read by someone who knows the language.